I saw my son stand up from across the room, and I just knew something terrible was about to happen. And when his voice cut through all the birthday music and laughter and he shouted those words, "He's a gold digger," the entire restaurant went silent, and I watched Marcus, sitting right beside me with his hand on my knee. Under the table, reached down slowly for the backpack at his feet, and I swear to God my heart stopped beating. If you're listening to my story, stay with me, because nothing, absolutely nothing was what it looked like that night. I'm Janet. I turned 60 years old on that Saturday evening in April. And the man everyone was staring at, the man my son just accused of using me for money in front of 75 people, was 32 years old, and I knew exactly how this looked. I knew exactly what everyone in that room was thinking, because I'd thought it myself 1,000 times in the 8 months we'd been together. But right then, watching Marcus unzip that worn green backpack with hands that were shaking just slightly, I realized I didn't know anything at all. The party was at Russo's, this Italian place in downtown Portland that I'd been going to for 20 years, the kind of restaurant with red checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles and photos of Italy covering every inch of the walls. My daughter Emily had organized everything, reserved the back room, invited everyone I knew, co-workers from the hospital where I work as a nurse, my sister and her family, neighbors, friends from book club, my ex-husband even, though he sat at a table in the corner looking uncomfortable the whole time. Emily had spent weeks planning it, kept telling me it was going to be special, kept asking me to please not bring Marcus, and I'd told her, no, absolutely not. If Marcus isn't welcome, then I'm not coming to my own birthday party. She'd backed down eventually, said fine. But Mom, you know how Brian feels, and I'd said yes, I know exactly how your brother feels. He's made it very clear. But this is my life, and Marcus is part of it now. Brian is my oldest, 34, works in finance, married to Christina, who comes from money. They have 2 kids in private school. They live in a house in the suburbs that looks like it belongs in a magazine. He'd hated Marcus from the first time I introduced them, 4 months into the relationship, when I finally worked up the courage to tell my kids I was seeing someone. Emily had been cautious but open-minded, asked questions, wanted to meet him, tried to understand. Brian had looked at me like I'd lost my mind, said, "Mom, he's younger than me," said, "What does a 32-year-old man want with a 60-year-old woman besides money?" Said, "You're making a fool of yourself," said, "Dad's only been gone 3 years." I'd told him his father had been sick for 5 years before he died, that I'd been alone and grieving and numb for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to be alive, and Marcus made me feel alive again. Brian had walked out of the restaurant where we were having that conversation and didn't speak to me for 6 weeks. But he'd come tonight, he and Christina and the kids, and I'd been so relieved, thought maybe he was finally coming around, maybe he could see how happy I was, how Marcus treated me with kindness and respect and genuine affection. I should have known better. I should have seen it coming in the way Brian kept drinking wine through dinner, glass after glass, in the way he kept staring at Marcus with this expression I couldn't quite read, something between anger and disgust and something else, something that looked almost like pain. Marcus had noticed too, I could tell. He'd gotten quieter as the night went on, kept his responses short when people tried to talk to him, and his hand found mine under the table and held on tight. Marcus worked at a community center in East Portland, taught art classes to kids, helped run after-school programs, made barely $30,000 a year. He lived in a studio apartment in a not-great neighborhood, drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic, with a dent in the passenger door, owned maybe 5 shirts total that he rotated through. When we'd met, I'd been volunteering at the same community center, helping with a health and wellness program for seniors. And he'd asked if I could look at a cut on his hand that wouldn't stop bleeding, some accident with a pottery wheel. I'd bandaged it in the center's first aid room, and we'd started talking, and somehow an hour had passed. He'd asked if I wanted to get coffee. I'd said yes before I could overthink it. On that first coffee date, he'd told me he was 32, and I'd almost walked out. Thought there's no way, this is crazy, I'm old enough to be his mother, but something in his eyes made me stay, something genuine and kind and interested in me. Really interested, not in what I looked like or how old I was, but in who I was. My ex-husband Richard had been a good man, but he'd stopped seeing me years before he got sick. I'd become invisible to him. The woman who managed the house and raised the kids and worked night shifts at the hospital while he built his career. When he died, I'd grieved, but I'd also felt this terrible guilt, because part of me felt relieved, felt free, felt like maybe I could finally figure out who I was beyond being Richard's wife and Brian and Emily's mother. And then I'd met Marcus, and for the first time in my entire adult life, someone looked at me like I mattered, like I was interesting and desirable and worth their time. And yes, he was 32, and yes, I knew what people would say, but I didn't care. I was so tired of caring what people thought. Except I did care. Of course I did. I cared desperately what my children thought. What my sister thought, what my coworkers whispered about when I wasn't around. I saw the looks when Marcus and I went out to dinner. Saw the judgment in strangers' eyes. The assumption that I was either delusional or being used or both. I'd introduced Marcus to my coworkers at a hospital holiday party. And the next day, 3 different nurses had pulled me aside to ask if I was sure I knew what I was doing, if I'd thought about the age difference, if I'd considered that maybe he had ulterior motives. I'd smiled and said I appreciated their concern, but I was fine, I was happy. And they'd nodded, but I could see they didn't believe me. My sister had been more direct, said, "Janet, honey, you're a beautiful woman, but you have to be realistic. You have a house and a pension and savings. This boy," and she'd actually called him a boy, "this boy can barely pay his rent. Don't you think that might be part of the attraction for him?" I'd asked Marcus about it directly. One night, about 2 months in, we'd been lying in bed in my house and I'd just said it. "Are you with me because of my money?" He'd looked at me for a long moment, his face serious, and then he'd said, "No, I'm with you because you're the first person I've met in years who treats me like I'm more than just a screw-up, who listens when I talk about the kids I work with like it actually matters, who laughs at my jokes, even when they're not funny, who makes me feel like maybe I'm doing something right with my life." And then he'd told me something he hadn't told me before, that he'd grown up in foster care, that he'd aged out of the system at 18 with nothing, that he'd been homeless for a while, that he'd made a lot of bad choices and hurt a lot of people, and spent his 20s trying to figure out how to be a person worth knowing. He said the community center had saved him, that working with kids who needed someone to believe in them had given him purpose, and meeting me had made him believe that maybe he could have more than just purpose. Maybe he could have connection, love, a real relationship with someone who saw him. I'd believed him that night, and I'd kept believing him through all the sideways comments from my family, through my son's anger and my sister's concern, and the looks from strangers. But there were moments, late at night when I couldn't sleep, when I'd wonder if I was being naive, if everyone else could see something I couldn't, if I was setting myself up to be hurt. Marcus never asked me for money, never hinted that he needed help, always insisted on paying for his half of things, even though I made 4 times what he made and could easily afford to treat. But he'd moved some of his clothes into my house after about 5 months, started staying over most nights, and I knew people saw that as proof, saw him living in my nice house in my nice neighborhood as evidence that he was using me, never mind that he still paid rent on his studio, still drove his beat-up car, still wore the same 5 shirts. The party had been going well up until the moment it wasn't. We'd had dinner, everyone sang happy birthday. I'd blown out 60 candles on this enormous cake Emily had ordered, decorated with flowers made of frosting. I'd made a speech thanking everyone for coming, thanking my kids for organizing this, and Marcus had sat beside me the whole time, quiet but present, his hand finding mine whenever I needed steadying. He'd met my coworkers before, had been polite and charming, asked them questions about their work, remembered names and details from previous conversations. He'd met Richard's sister and her husband and had somehow gotten them talking about their recent trip to New Zealand for 20 minutes. He'd played with Brian's kids before dinner, helped my grandson with some handheld video game I didn't understand, made my granddaughter laugh with a magic trick involving a quarter. I'd watched him with my grandchildren and felt this ache in my chest, thinking about how good he was with kids, how patient, how present. Brian had watched too, I'd noticed, had seen his son climb into Marcus's lap without hesitation, had seen his daughter ask Marcus to sit next to her at dinner, and something in Brian's face had shifted, gotten darker. When Marcus had excused himself to go to the bathroom between the main course and dessert, Brian had come over to my table, leaned down close, and said, "Mom, we need to talk about this. We need to talk about him." And I'd said, "Not now, Brian, please. This is my birthday." And he'd said, "That's exactly why we need to talk about it, because you deserve better than some con artist who's playing you for your money." I'd felt my face go hot, felt tears starting, and I'd said, "You don't know him. You don't know what you're talking about." And Brian had said, "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know his type." And then Marcus had come back from the bathroom, and Brian had walked away. After cake, there'd been coffee and more wine, and people had started mingling, moving between tables, the noise level rising as conversations overlapped. I'd been talking to my sister and two of my coworkers when I saw Brian stand up from his table across the room. He had his wine glass in his hand, and he tapped it with a spoon. Tap, 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 and gradually people quieted down, turned to look at him. My stomach dropped. I just knew this wasn't going to be a nice toast. Wasn't going to be a sweet memory or a funny story. Emily was across the room, and she must have known too, because I saw her face go pale, saw her start to stand up like she was going to try to stop him, but Brian was already talking. He said, "I'd like to say a few words about my mother," and people smiled, settled in to listen, and he said, "My mother is one of the strongest people I know. She raised 2 kids mostly on her own, while Dad worked constantly. She worked night shifts at the hospital so she could be home with us during the day. She took care of Dad for 5 years while he was dying, and never once complained," and people were nodding along, agreeing, and I could feel where this was going, could feel the trap closing. Brian said, "My mother deserves happiness, deserves respect, deserves to be with someone who values her for who she is." And then his voice changed, got harder, and he said, "Which is why it breaks my heart to watch her be taken advantage of by someone who's clearly using her." The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Everyone turned to look at me and Marcus, and I felt my face burning, felt my hands shaking, wanted to disappear into the floor. Brian kept going, said, "I've kept my mouth shut for 8 months. I've tried to be supportive. I've tried to give he paused, "this relationship the benefit of the doubt, but I can't do it anymore. I can't watch my mother be played for a fool by a gold digger who moved into her house and is clearly after her money." Someone gasped. I think it was my sister, and Emily was saying, "Brian, stop right now." But Brian wasn't stopping. He was looking directly at Marcus. "Now," said, "you're 32 years old with no career and no prospects, living rent free in my mother's house. You think we don't all see exactly what this is?" I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think. The entire room was staring at us, and I wanted to say something, wanted to defend Marcus, wanted to scream at my son, but no words would come out. I looked at Marcus, and his face was completely blank, no expression at all, and he was staring down at the table, his hands in his lap, and for a horrible second I thought he was going to get up and leave, thought he was going to walk out and I'd never see him again. And maybe that would be easier. Maybe that would make all of this stop. But instead, he reached down, slowly, and picked up his backpack from the floor beside his chair. It was this old green canvas backpack he always carried, worn and faded and patched in places, and I'd never really thought about. It was just something he always had with him, but now everyone was watching as he set it on his lap and unzipped it. His hands were shaking slightly. I could see that even though he was trying to keep them steady, and he reached inside and pulled out a folder, one of those manila folders, bent at the corners and clearly well used. He set it on the table in front of him and then reached in again and pulled out another folder, and then another, and then a stack of papers held together with a rubber band, and then a small photo album, the kind you buy at the drugstore, and he laid everything out on the table very carefully, very precisely, and the whole time he didn't say anything, didn't look at anyone, just kept pulling things out of that backpack until there was a small pile of documents and photos and papers in front of him. Then he looked up, looked directly at Brian, and his voice when he spoke was quiet, but everyone could hear it in that silent room. He said, "You want to know why I'm with your mother? You want to know what kind of person I am? Fine, I'll show you." He opened the first folder and pulled out what looked like medical bills, dozens of them, and he said, "These are bills from your mother's hospital stay 2 years ago, before I met her, when she had that emergency surgery for the ruptured appendix." He spread them out on the table and said the insurance covered most of it, but not all. She had about $8,000 in medical debt that she was paying off in tiny increments every month. $50 here, $75 there, because she was also helping pay your sister's graduate school loans, and she'd just spent $15,000 on a new roof for her house because the old one was leaking. My heart was pounding. I hadn't known he knew about the medical bills. I'd never told him about them, never told anyone really, just paid them quietly every month and tried not to think about how long it would take. He pulled out more papers, said, "I found out about the debt about 3 months into our relationship. She left some bills on the kitchen counter and I saw them and I asked her about it and she said it was fine. She had it under control, but it wasn't fine. She was stressed about it, I could tell. So I paid them off," he said, his voice still quiet but steady. "I'd been saving money for years, ever since I got the job at the community center, saving for maybe someday I could go back to school or buy a car that didn't break down every other month or just have some security, some cushion, and I had about $12,000 saved up, and I used $8,000 of it to pay off her medical debt." I felt tears starting, couldn't stop them, reached up to wipe my eyes and my hands were shaking. He pulled out receipts, actual paper receipts, old and faded, said, "These are from every time I've bought groceries for the house, every time I've filled up her car with gas, every time I've paid for dinner or a movie or anything else. I kept every single receipt because I knew people would think I was using her. I knew her family would think I was after her money, so I documented everything." He spread the receipts out, and there were hundreds of them, literally hundreds, months and months of groceries and gas and dinners, and a receipt for 4 new tires for my car, because mine were bald and dangerous, and I'd been putting off replacing them and he'd taken my car one Saturday and come back with new tires and refused to tell me what they cost. He opened the second folder and pulled out what looked like a lease agreement, said, "This is the lease for my studio apartment, which I still pay for every month, $600, because your mother never asked me to move in. I still have my own place. I just stay at her house most nights because she has nightmares sometimes. Dreams about your father dying, and she wakes up scared and alone, and I want to be there when that happens." I didn't know anyone else knew about the nightmares. I'd told Marcus about them. After he'd been there for one, had woken up gasping and crying, and he'd held me until I could breathe again. But I'd never told my kids, never told anyone. Had felt like it was something I should be over by now, 3 years later. He pulled out more papers, said, "These are pay stubs from my job, every single one for the past 8 months. You can see exactly how much I make. You can see that yes, it's not much, but I pay my own bills. I don't ask your mother for money. I've never asked her for money." He pulled out a small notebook, spiral-bound and worn, said, "I keep track of every expense, split everything 50-50 or as close to it as I can manage, and when I can't afford my half, I just don't do whatever it is. I don't go. I don't participate. I don't let her pay for me." My sister was crying now. I could see her wiping her eyes, and some of my coworkers were crying, too. And Brian was standing completely still, his face white, the wine glass still in his hand. Marcus opened the photo album, the small drugstore one, and he pulled out pictures, old pictures. Most of them bent and faded, said, "These are from when I was a kid, foster care, 7. Different homes between ages 6 and 18, and he showed a picture of himself maybe age 10, skinny and serious looking, standing in front of a house with 3 other kids, none of them smiling. He said I had nothing, no family, no support, no money for college. I aged out at 18 and I was homeless for 2 years, slept in my car when I had a car, slept in shelters when I didn't, made a lot of bad choices because I didn't know how to make good ones, didn't have anyone to teach me." He showed another picture, himself in his early 20s, looking rough, exhausted, defeated. He said the community center gave me a chance when no one else would, They hired me part-time to help with after-school programs and eventually made me full-time, and I started taking online classes. Finished my bachelor's degree last year in social work, and he pulled out a piece of paper, his actual diploma, California State University, printed at the top, and I realized I'd never seen it. He'd told me he graduated, but he'd never shown me. Never made a big deal of it. He said, I don't have money, but I have a degree now, and I have a career I care about, and I have kids I work with who need me, and I have your mother, who's the best thing that ever happened to me, who makes me want to be better than I am, who believes in me even when I don't believe in myself. His voice cracked slightly on the last part and he stopped, took a breath, and then he pulled out one more piece of paper, and his hand was really shaking now as he unfolded it. He said, this is a life insurance policy. I took it out 4 months ago, $50,000. Your mother is the beneficiary. And before anyone says anything, yes, I know 50,000 isn't much compared to what she probably has in retirement and savings, but it's what I can afford. It's $30 a month. And I pay it because if something happens to me, I want her to have something. I want her to be okay. He looked at Brian again, said, you want to call me a gold digger, fine, call me whatever you want. But know what you're actually saying, know what you're accusing me of, because I love your mother. I love her more than I've ever loved anyone, and everything I have, every dollar I can scrape together, goes toward taking care of her, or making her life better, or just being worthy of her. He put all the papers back in the folders, stacked them neatly, put them back in the backpack, and then he stood up, said, I'm sorry, Janet, I'm sorry I ruined your birthday, and he started to walk toward the exit, and I couldn't let him leave. Couldn't let him walk out. I stood up so fast, I knocked my chair over, and I said, Marcus, wait, please wait. And my voice came out too loud, almost a shout, and he stopped but didn't turn around. I walked over to him, my legs shaky, my vision blurred with tears, and I put my hand on his arm, and he finally turned and looked at me, and his eyes were red, wet, and I said, don't you dare apologize, don't you dare. None of this is your fault. I turned around to face everyone, face my son, and I said, Brian, how could you do this? And my voice was shaking, but I kept going, said, you have no idea what you're talking about. You have no idea who he is or what he's done or how he treats me. All you see is his age and his bank account, and you made up your mind. And you decided to humiliate him, to humiliate me, at my own birthday party in front of everyone I know. Brian's face was crumpling. I could see tears starting in his eyes too, and he said, Mom, I was trying to protect you. I really thought, and I said, you thought what? That I'm some stupid old woman who can't see when she's being used, that I'm so desperate for attention I'd ignore obvious red flags? I felt anger rising up in me, anger I'd been pushing down for months, and I said, I've spent my entire life taking care of other people, taking care of you and your sister and your father, working myself to exhaustion so everyone else could have what they needed, and the first time I choose something for myself, choose someone who makes me happy. You decide I must be wrong, I must be making a mistake, because clearly I'm not smart enough to make my own decisions. Emily was standing now, had come over to me, and she said, Mom, I'm sorry. We're so sorry. I didn't know he was going to do this, and I said, but you agreed with him, didn't you? You both thought the same thing, that Marcus was using me, that I was being a fool. Emily was crying, said, I was worried about you. I'm still worried about you. And I said, worried about what? Worried that I might, actually, be happy. That I might have someone who cares about me, someone who sees me as more than just a mother or a nurse or a widow. I looked at Brian, said, you have Christina, you have your kids, you have your perfect life in your perfect house, and you're so convinced that no one could actually love your mother without an ulterior motive that you'd rather destroy my relationship than consider that maybe, just maybe, I found something real. Brian was crying now too, actually crying, and he said, I'm sorry, Godmom, I'm so sorry. I was wrong, I was so wrong. And Christina was beside him looking horrified, looking at the pile of papers on the table that Marcus had left there. My sister came over, took my hand, said, Janet, honey, we didn't know, we really didn't know, and I pulled my hand away, said, you didn't know, because you didn't ask, because you all decided what this was without ever actually getting to know him, without giving him a chance. Marcus was still standing there, frozen, and I turned back to him and said, I'm so sorry you had to do that, had to prove yourself like that. And he shook his head, said it's okay, it's not your fault. But I said no, it's not okay. You shouldn't have to carry around proof that you're a good person. You shouldn't have to document every dollar you spend just to convince people you're not a con artist. I looked around the room at all these people I knew, people I worked with, people I'd been friends with for years, and they were all staring at us. And I felt exhausted suddenly, completely drained, and I said, I think we should go. I think we should just go. And Marcus nodded. We started walking toward the exit, and Emily called out, Mom, wait, please don't leave like this. And I stopped, looked back at her, said, I need some time, I need some space, I'll call you tomorrow or the next day, but right now, I just need to leave. Brian was standing there looking destroyed, and part of me wanted to go to him, wanted to comfort him because he's my son and I love him. But I couldn't. Not right then. I was too angry and too hurt and too tired. We walked out of the restaurant into the cool April night, and I realized I was still crying. Couldn't seem to stop. And Marcus put his arm around me, and we walked to my car in silence. I gave him the keys, said, Can you drive? I don't think I can, and he nodded, helped me into the passenger seat, got in the driver's side, and just sat there for a moment, both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Then he said, Janet, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. If I hadn't come tonight, if I just stayed home like Emily asked, and I cut him off, said, Don't you dare blame yourself. This is on them. This is on my kids and their judgment and their assumptions. He started the car, pulled out of the parking lot, and we drove home in silence. And the silence felt heavy, felt full of all the things we weren't saying. When we got to my house, he parked in the driveway and turned off the car, but neither of us moved to get out. We just sat there in the dark. Finally, I said, Did you really use your savings to pay off my medical bills? And he said yes. And I said, Why didn't you tell me? And he said, Because you wouldn't have let me. You would have insisted you could handle it yourself. And you could have. I know you could have, but I wanted to help. I wanted to do something that mattered. I started crying again, said that was $8,000. That was everything you'd saved. And he said, It wasn't everything. I still had enough for a few months of expenses. And besides, what was I going to do with it? Buy a new car, go on a trip. It was just money sitting in an account, and being able to help you, being able to take that stress off your shoulders, that was worth more than any car or trip. I said you kept all those receipts. For 8 months you kept every receipt, and he said I kept them from the beginning, from that first coffee date, because I knew people would think I was after your money. I knew your family would hate me, and I wanted to be able to prove I wasn't. I wanted to have evidence that I was paying my way. I felt something break open in my chest. Said you shouldn't have to do that. You shouldn't have to prove yourself like that. And he said maybe not, but it's reality. I'm 32 and you're 60, and people are going to judge, people are going to assume, and I'd rather have proof than just hope people believe me. I said, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have defended you better. I should have shut Brian down before it got that far. And he said, You did defend me. You left your own birthday party for me. You stood up to your son for me. That's more than anyone's ever done. We finally went inside, and the house felt too quiet, too empty. And I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to process everything that had just happened. Marcus said, Do you want me to make tea? And I nodded, and we went to the kitchen, and he put the kettle on and got out mugs and tea bags, and we moved around each other in this familiar dance we'd developed over months of shared mornings and evenings, and there was something comforting about the normalcy of it after the chaos of the party. When the tea was ready, we sat at the kitchen table, and I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and said, Tell me about the life insurance policy. When did you do that? And he said, About 4 months ago, around the time I realized I was in love with you, that this wasn't just dating anymore. This was real, and I wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of if something happened to me. I said $50,000 is a lot of money for someone making $30,000 a year to commit to. And he said, It's $30 a month. I can manage $30 a month. I just eat out less. And I almost laughed, except I was crying again. Said you shouldn't have to eat out less. You already barely spend. Money on yourself. And he said, I spend money on what matters, and you matter. You're what matters most. I said, why didn't you tell me any of this? Why did you keep it all secret? And he said, because I didn't want you to feel obligated to me. I didn't want you to stay with me because I paid off your debt, or because I keep track of expenses, or because I took out a life insurance policy. I wanted you to stay with me because you wanted to, because you loved me, not because you owed me. I reached across the table and took his hand, said, I do love you. I love you so much. And I'm sorry my family treated you like that. I'm sorry my son called you a gold digger in front of everyone, and he squeezed my hand, said, your son loves you. He was trying to protect you. He was wrong, but his heart was in the right place. I said, I don't know if I can forgive him for this, not right away, and Marcus said, you don't have to forgive him right away. You can take all the time you need, but eventually, maybe eventually you can, because he's your son and you love him and he made a mistake, a big mistake, but people make mistakes. I said, you're too generous, too forgiving, and he said, I've made enough mistakes in my life to know that sometimes people deserve second chances. We finished our tea and went to bed, and I lay there in the dark with Marcus's arm around me, and I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. I thought about Brian's face when he stood up to make that speech, the conviction in his voice, the certainty that he was right, that he was protecting me. I thought about Emily's tears, her apologies, the way she'd said, I didn't know he was going to do this. I thought about all those people in the restaurant, people I knew, people I worked with, watching as my son called the man I loved a gold digger. Watching as Marcus pulled out folders and receipts and photos and actually proved that he wasn't, that he was exactly the opposite of what Brian had accused him of being. I thought about those medical bills, $8,000 that had been hanging over me for 2 years, that I'd been chipping away at month by month, $50 here, 75% there, and the stress of it, the constant weight of that debt, and how one day it had just been gone, paid off, and I'd gotten a letter from the hospital saying my balance was zero, and I'd thought there must be some mistake, had called them to check, and they'd confirmed it was paid, and I'd been so relieved, so grateful, had assumed maybe my insurance had covered more than I thought, had never imagined that Marcus had found those bills and paid them off without telling me. I thought about him saving that money, working at the community center for years, living in a tiny studio apartment, driving a car that barely worked, saving every extra dollar, and then spending $8,000 of it, more than half of what he'd saved, on me, on my debt, and never saying a word. I thought about all those receipts, hundreds of them, months of documentation, every grocery trip, every tank of gas, every dinner out, proof that he was paying his share, proof that he wasn't using me, and how he'd kept them because he knew what people would think, knew what my family would assume, and he'd wanted to be able to prove them wrong if he had to, and tonight he'd had to pull out that backpack and lay his entire life on the table for everyone to judge. I thought about the life insurance policy, $30 a month that he paid even though he barely had money for himself, paid because he loved me, because he wanted me to be okay if something happened to him, and the absolute humility of it, of a 32-year-old man with nothing taking out a policy to protect a 60-year-old woman who had so much more than he did. My phone buzzed on the nightstand and I picked it up, saw a text from Emily. Mom, I'm so sorry, please. Call me when you can. We need to talk. I love you. And then another text from Brian. Mom, I don't even know what to say. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I love you. And I put the phone down without responding. Couldn't deal with it yet. Didn't know what to say. Marcus stirred beside me, said, can't sleep. And I said no, and he said me neither. And we lay there together in the dark, both of us awake, both of us thinking about what had happened. And finally I said, what are we going to do now? And he said, I don't know. What do you want to do? And I said, I don't know either. The next morning I woke up to more texts, from Emily, from Brian, from my sister, from 2 of my coworkers. Everyone apologizing, everyone saying they didn't know, didn't understand, everyone wanting to talk. I ignored them all, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with Marcus and said, I'm taking a few days off work. I need some time to process this. And he said, do you want me to stay or give you space? And I said, stay. Please stay. I don't want to be alone. We spent the day quietly, didn't talk much, watched movies, made simple meals. And it felt good, felt peaceful, felt like maybe we could get through this. But I knew I'd have to talk to my kids eventually. Knew I'd have to deal with what had happened, couldn't avoid it forever. On the third day, I finally called Emily, said we need to talk, and she said, yes, please, can I come over? And I said, yes. She arrived an hour later, came in looking nervous, her eyes red like she'd been crying, and she hugged me tight, said, Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. I had no idea Brian was going to do that. I knew he was angry, but I didn't think he did actually, and she trailed off, and I said, sit down. We need to talk about this. She sat on the couch, and I sat across from her and said, what did you think was going to happen? Did you really think confronting Marcus at my birthday party was going to end well? And she said, I didn't know he was going to confront him. I swear I didn't. He told me he wanted to make a toast, just a nice speech about you, and I believed him. I said, but you agreed with him, didn't you? You thought Marcus was using me, and she was quiet for a moment, then said, yes, I thought that. I was worried that's what was happening, and I said, why? What did Marcus ever do to make you think that? And she said nothing. That's the thing. He never did anything wrong. He was always kind and respectful. And good to you, but the age difference, Mom, it's so big, and I just kept thinking, what does a 32-year-old want with my 60-year-old mother? And the only answer I could come up with was money. I felt anger rising again. Said, so you just assumed the worst of him without ever giving him a chance, without ever actually getting to know him, and she said, yes, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was wrong. She said when he pulled out all those papers, when I saw the medical bills and the receipts and the life insurance policy, I realized how wrong I was, how I'd completely misjudged him, and I felt horrible. I felt sick, and I still feel sick. I said, good, you should feel sick, you should feel horrible, because what Brian did, what you enabled, by agreeing with him, was cruel, it was humiliating, and Marcus didn't deserve any of it. She was crying now, said, I know, and I don't know how to make it right. I don't know how to apologize enough. And I said, I don't know either. I honestly don't know if you can make this right. We talked for another hour, went in circles. She kept apologizing and I kept being angry, and eventually we both just sat there in silence, exhausted. Finally, she said, do you really love him? And I said, yes. I really love him, more than I thought I could love anyone again. And she said, does he really love you? And I said, yes, I believe he does. I believe everything he showed us that night was real. And she nodded. Said, I believe it too. I believe him. And I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. She left eventually, said she'd call in a few days, said she loved me. And I said, I loved her too, but I needed time, needed space to figure out how to move forward. Brian was harder. I didn't call him, made him wait almost a week, and when I finally did call, he answered on the first ring, said, Mom, thank God, I've been so worried, and I said, we need to talk, and he said, yes, please, can I come over? And I said, no, not yet. I don't want you in my house right now. Meet me at the park near your place. We met the next day, sat on a bench by the playground where his kids were playing. And he looked terrible, looked like he hadn't slept in days, and he said, Mom, I don't even know how to begin to apologize. What I did was unforgivable, and I said, yes, it was unforgivable, and I'm not sure I can forgive you. Not right now. He said, I was so sure I was right. I was so convinced he was using you. And I thought I was protecting you. Thought I was being a good son. And instead, I humiliated you and him in front of everyone you know, and I can't take it back. I can't undo it, and I hate myself for it. I said, you don't get to hate yourself. You don't get to make yourself the victim here. You did this. You chose to stand up in that restaurant and call the man I love a gold digger. Without any proof, without any evidence, just based on your assumptions and your judgment, and you were wrong. You were completely wrong, And your being sorry doesn't fix what you broke. He said, I know I can't fix it, but I want to try. I want to make it right somehow. And I said, I don't know if you can. I don't know if I even want you to try because the fact that you could think that about me, that you could think I'm so stupid or so desperate that I'd be fooled by some con artist, that hurts worse than anything else. He said, I didn't think you were stupid. I just thought you were vulnerable, thought. You were lonely after Dad died and maybe not seeing things clearly, and I said I am lonely. I was lonely. But that doesn't mean I'm not capable of making good decisions. That doesn't mean I can't recognize when someone genuinely cares about me. I said Marcus paid off $8,000 of my debt without telling me he's been keeping receipts. For 8 months to prove he's not using me, he took out a life insurance policy to make sure I'd be okay if something happened to him. And you called him a gold digger. You accused him of using me in front of 75 people, and you didn't even know him. Didn't even try to know him. Brian said, you're right. You're absolutely right. I didn't try to know him. I just judged him, and I was wrong. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to make this up to you. To both of you. If you'll let me. I said, I don't know if I'll let you. I don't know if I can trust you anymore, and he looked at me with these devastated eyes and said, Mom, please, please don't. Shut me out. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you. I'm your son. I love you. And I made a terrible mistake, but please don't give up on me. I felt my anger start to crack, felt tears coming, said, you hurt me. You hurt Marcus. You did something I can. Forget. And even if I forgive you eventually, it's not going to be the same. We're not going to be the same. He said, I know. I accept that. I'll accept whatever you need. Just please don't cut me out of your life completely. I left that conversation without promising him anything. Told him I needed more time, needed to figure out what I wanted. And he nodded, said, take all the time you need. I'll be here whenever you're ready. I drove home feeling drained, feeling like I'd aged 10 years in the past week. And when I got home, Marcus was in the kitchen making dinner, and I walked up behind him and wrapped my arms around him and just held on, and he turned around and held me, and neither of us said anything, just stood there holding each other. Over the next few weeks, things slowly started to settle. Life went back to something resembling normal. I went back to work, Marcus went back to his job at the community center, and we fell back into our routines. Emily called every few days, kept apologizing, kept asking if she could see me. And eventually I said yes, and we had lunch, and it was awkward, but we talked. Really talked, and she told me about her own fears about aging, about watching me get older and worrying about losing me, and how seeing me with someone so much younger made her afraid that I was trying to recapture something that was gone. And I told her I wasn't trying to recapture anything, I was just trying to live. Just trying to be happy. And she said she understood now, said she saw how Marcus looked at me and how I looked at him, and she believed it was real. Brian took longer. I made him wait, made him sit with what he'd done, and finally, after about 2 months, I agreed to have dinner with him and Christina and the kids at their house. It was tense at first. Everyone too polite, too careful, and then Marcus did something that broke the ice. He brought a painting he'd made. Something he'd worked on at the community center with some of the kids, and he gave it to my grandson, said, I heard you like dinosaurs, thought you might want this. And it was a painting of a T-Rex, bright colors, and kind of messy but clearly done with care. And my grandson's face lit up and he said, this is so cool, thank you, Marcus, and he ran off to hang it in his room, and suddenly the tension eased just a little. Brian pulled Marcus aside after dinner. I watched them through the kitchen window, saw Brian talking, gesturing, and Marcus listening. And then I saw Brian wipe his eyes. And Marcus put his hand on his shoulder, and when they came back inside, Brian's eyes were red, but he looked lighter somehow. Looked like maybe he could forgive himself. Later that night as we were leaving, Brian hugged me, said thank you for giving me another chance. I don't deserve it, but thank you. And I said, I'm doing this for me, not for you. I'm doing this because you're my son, and I love you, and I don't want to lose you. But things are different. Now we're different now. And he said, I know, I understand. I'll earn your trust back, I promise. Months passed, then a year, and slowly, carefully, my family learned to accept Marcus, learned to see him the way I saw him, learned that sometimes love doesn't look the way you expect it to, but that doesn't make it less real. Marcus and I are still together, still happy, still navigating the looks and the judgment from strangers, but not caring as much because we have each other and we have, finally, my family's acceptance. My grandkids adore him, ask for him when I come to visit without him, and that means more to me than almost anything. I'm 61 now, Marcus is 33, and sometimes I still can't believe this is my life, that I found love again when I thought that part of my life was over, that I found someone who sees me, really sees me, not as someone to take care of or someone who needs protection, but just as me, Janet, a woman who's lived and loved and lost and is still here, still trying, still open to whatever comes next. And yeah, sometimes I still wake up with nightmares about Richard dying, and Marcus is still there, still holding me until I can breathe again. And sometimes he has bad days where the weight of his childhood, of everything he went through, catches up with him, and I'm there, holding him, reminding him he's not that scared kid anymore. He's a man who helps other kids avoid the path he took, and we take care of each other. That's what we do. That night at my birthday party, when Brian called Marcus a gold digger, and Marcus opened that backpack, that was the moment everything changed. The moment my family had to confront their assumptions and their judgment. And it wasn't easy, it wasn't clean, but it was necessary, and I'm grateful for it, even though it was horrible to live through, because it forced everyone to see the truth, forced them to see Marcus for who he really is and to see me for who I really am. Not someone who needs protecting, but someone who's capable of choosing her own path, her own love, her own life. And that green backpack, that worn, faded, patched-together backpack that Marcus still carries everywhere, that's become a reminder to me. A symbol of everything he is, everything he was willing to show, everything he was willing to prove. And every time I see it, I remember that night. And I remember that love, real love, isn't about age or money or what other people think. It is about showing up, being honest, taking care of each other, and sometimes, when you have to, opening up everything you are and laying it out on the table, and saying, here, this is me, this is what I have, and hoping it's enough.